Thus Spoke Zarathustra is one of the most influential, yet most misunderstood books in philosophy. It isn't a systematic argument like a textbook. No, the book follows the fictional prophet Zarathustra, who descends from years of solitude in the mountains to teach humanity a new way of understanding itself after the quote-unquote death of God. The central question is not simply what should we believe now, it is how should human beings create meaning when inherited certainties no longer command belief? Number one, the foundation, quote unquote, God is dead. Number two, the famous declaration, God is dead, does not mean that Nietzsche is claiming God has literally died. Number three, rather, it describes a cultural transformation. Number four, for centuries, the Western civilization grounded morality, purpose, truth, and value in Christianity. Nietzsche argues that science, historical criticism, and modern thought have eroded the authority of that framework. The problem is not that people stopped believing, the problem is that many still live as if the old foundations remain intact. So his question becomes, if absolute authority disappears, what becomes the source of value? Everything else in the book follows from this question. So in Zarathustra's descent, he spends 10 years alone in the mountains. Then he returns because wisdom has become meaningless if it remains private. His movement down from the mountain symbolizes a shift. Wisdom must enter ordinary life. This echoes religious traditions like the Bible, where prophets descend from encounters with the divine to speak to society. Nietzsche deliberately borrows the structure while replacing divine revelation with human self-overcoming. So now we go to the Overman, or quote unquote the Übermensch. And this is probably Nietzsche's most famous and most misinterpreted idea, because the Overman is not a superior person, a political ruler, or a particular race. Instead, the Overman represents a possibility for human development. The Overman basically creates values instead of merely inheriting them, accepts life's uncertainty as he embraces suffering as a part of growth. This implies his innate state of being is that of which continually transforms rather than seeking a final fixed identity. The Overman is not an endpoint, but an orientation toward continual self-creation. Now we can choose to see humanity as a bridge here. One of the book's defining images is man is something that shall be overcome. Nietzsche does not mean humanity should be despised. Instead, he means human beings are transitional. We're a bridge between instinct and higher possibilities. The danger is treating our current condition as final, because growth requires remaining unfinished. The three metamorphoses. I like this model here. We'll go deeper into this model, and it's perhaps the clearest summary of Nietzsche's psychology, fundamentally. So first we have the first metamorphosis, which is the camel. The camel bears burdens. It asks, what must I endure? The stage represents discipline, learning, obedience, and carrying inherited values. Without becoming a camel, there is nothing to transcend. The lion enters the desert. Its task is to destroy. It says, I will. The lion rejects external authority. It defeats the dragon whose scales read, and quote unquote, thou shalt. Yet destruction alone creates nothing. So now, the metamorphosis is the child, and the child creates. He says, yes. And this is Nietzsche's idea, funnily enough, which I can get down with if you're fundamentally not an abusive type of person. If you are, then I see a potential fourth metamorphosis. For example, which I initially cycle between potentially being the inverted tree in Bhagavad Gita, whose roots are in the transcendent and branches extend into the world, which would allude to Carl Jung's idea that the individuation process involves both personal development and connection to deeper collective patterns. But no, it's a bit more dialed on a clock in a sense, since we live in the West here. So I would describe it as more like the gardener archetype. So instead, I look to connect the zenith of the idea to pranayama as cultivation. And introducing pranayama changes the emphasis from philosophy alone to embodied practice. Rather than knowledge producing transformation, discipline, attention to breath becomes part of the process. Whether one interprets this literally, spiritually, or psychologically, the symbolism is clear. Transformation is not merely intellectual, it is enacted through repeated practice. A possible fourth metamorphosis. If I had to give the symbol a concise philosophical description, it might be something like the gardener remembers the roots, prunes dying branches, accepts seasonal cycles, cultivates conditions rather than controlling outcomes, knows that growth and decay belong together. Unlike the child who delights in spontaneous creation, the gardener must also preserve, discern, and let go. This isn't necessarily higher than Nietzsche's child, but it does extend the metaphor towards continuity and care. Creation replaces mere rebellion. Many people remain lions for life, defining themselves only by opposition. Nietzsche argues genuine freedom requires being capable of creating new values rather than merely rejecting old ones. Now we look to the book's approach to self overcoming. This may be the book's central ethical idea, honestly, as every achievement eventually becomes another obstacle. Even the power of the child's archetype's ability to create begs the question, even creativity must eventually become something that can be relinquished. So the self must repeatedly overcome itself. Identity is therefore dynamic. One never arrives, and this contrasts with philosophy seeking permanent enlightenment or final completion. So now we have the idea of eternal recurrence. And near the center of Nietzsche's thought lies a difficult thought experiment. Imagine living your exact life, every joy, every mistake, every humiliation, every success, again, forever. Could you affirm it? The point is not cosmology, it is existential honesty. If the answer is no, what would need to change about how you live? Eternal recurrence becomes a measure of whether one has embraced life deeply enough to will its repetition. And now we move to the idea of amor fati, which is closely relating to the idea that is often summarized elsewhere as the quote-unquote love of fate. Nietzsche does not recommend passive acceptance. He suggests something stronger. To love one's fate means saying yes, not only to pleasures but also to suffering, because both contribute to who one becomes. Now solitude. Through the book, Zarathustra repeatedly withdraws. Solitude serves two functions. First, it protects creative thought from conformity. Second, it reminds readers that prolonged isolation eventually becomes limiting. Wisdom must alternate between solitude and community. Friendship. Nietzsche has a demanding view of friendship. True friends should not merely comfort one another, they should challenge one another toward greater growth. Friendship becomes mutual elevation rather than mutual reassurance. Next, compassion. Nietzsche criticizes forms of pity that reduce others to helplessness. He worries compassion can unintentionally preserve weakness when it replaces opportunities for growth. This is one of his most controversial ideas. It should not be confused with advocating cruelty. Rather, he questions whether every form of help is genuinely helpful. And so good and evil. Zarathustra repeatedly attacks rigid moral categories. Instead of asking, what is universally good? Nietzsche increasingly asks, what allows life to flourish? Morality becomes contextual and creative rather than a fixed and internal. The higher human. The higher human differs from the overman. These individuals represent humanity striving toward greater possibilities. They often fail. Failure itself becomes part of the process. And so we move to laughter. One of the book's most overlooked themes is laughter. Zarathustra laughs often. Laughter signals freedom from excessive seriousness. The strongest individual can hold profound truths without becoming crushed by them. Next, we move to dance. Dancing symbolizes affirmation. Rigid thinkers cannot dance. To dance is to move gracefully within uncertainty. Wisdom remains flexible. And now we move to the shadow. Zarathustra repeatedly encounters figures reflecting distorted aspects of himself. Growth requires integrating these dimensions rather than denying them. This anticipates later ideas in Carl Jung's psychology about confronting the shadow. Why Zarathustra keeps falling. Many readers expect the prophet to succeed. Instead, his audience repeatedly misunderstands him. And this is intentional. Truth cannot simply be transferred from teacher to student. Each person must become their own creator. The teacher eventually becomes unnecessary. The book's structure, the narrative itself, mirrors self-overcoming. Each section builds a temporary understanding only to exceed it later. Readers experience the same process Zarathustra advocates. And so now we can see the book begins with the collapse of inherited meaning and ends not replacing one dogma with another, but urging readers to become active participants in creating values through their own lives. Nietzsche does not promise certainty, perfection, or a final resting place. Instead, he portrays human flourishing as an ongoing practice of discipline, critique, creation, and affirmation. In that sense, Thus Spoke Zarathustra is less a manual for arriving at wisdom than a challenge to remain capable of transformation. Its deepest claim is that a meaningful life is not discovered fully formed. It is continually shaped through the courage to question inherited assumptions, to create responsibility, and to affirm existence even when it offers no guaranteed answers. Now, I'll go recommend books that resonate with this perspective. And rather than books that simply repeat Nietzsche, I'd suggest works that explore cycles of creation, cultivation, tradition, and integration. So first is the Upanishads. These texts investigate the relationship between the individual self and ultimate reality. Many of the symbolic image trees, breath, inner awareness, unity amid diversity parallels in the framework that we've been describing when Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So next we can have the Zen mind, beginner's mind. This book returns in a different register. It's something more like Nietzsche's work. It's a central insight that openness is not a phase to be outgrown, but a discipline to be continually renewed. It complements the idea of not becoming attached, even to one's own creative identity. The I Ching. Often misunderstood as merely an oracle, the I Ching is also a meditation on change. It portrays reality as a network of transformations rather than static states. If we're thinking in terms of roots, branches, cycles, and reciprocal relationships, it offers a rich symbolic vocabulary. Next, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It could be valuable to revisit Campbell after reading some of the works above, and you may find yourself agreeing with some parts and questioning others. Campbell is strongest when read as a comparative mythologist, rather than as someone describing a single universal pattern. And finally, on the last book on the recommendation list, we have The Denial of Death. This book adds a more psychological dimension to this conversation, and Becker argues that humans construct symbolic systems to cope with mortality. It raises a useful question. When does a symbolic framework cultivate life, and when does it become another way of avoiding impermanence?